in Wisconsin and throughout the nation, actually, in terms of presidential campaign. So just a couple house cleaning things. I do see that there are some new participants tonight. So you have a couple options for asking a question or commenting. There's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen is a chat, and there's a long, narrow, rectangular bar at the bottom of the chat box where you can write a message, click send, excuse me, and everybody will see it. The other option is you can ask a question through the audio. You see the ask a question button is on your screen. All you need to do is click on the ask a question button, and your name will come up, and you'll be put in the queue to ask a question. And then I can give you the audio or to ask your question. That way, if there's a follow-up, you can respond. And then when we're all done, I will take the audio back. And we'll go back into presenter mode. And throughout the course of the webinar tonight, there are going to be some polls, some questions. There are no wrong answers. This is to get your opinion, to get your input on certain messages and things about framing. So the poll will pop up on the screen, and you will be able to respond in time. And when everybody's had a chance to vote, I'll close the poll and let you know what the results are. So there we go. So there's the housekeeping. So on to our webinar for this evening. And the topic tonight is the destruction of Wisconsin's historical open government. And many of you have heard framing presentations and things like this. So we talk about changing public discourse. And what's really critical about this is that the frame is critical to long-term change. So if we want to change the direction of legislation, change the direction of public discourse, we need to change the frame. And nowhere is that more evident than in the entire perception in the public of government. And we'll get into what the conservative viewpoint of government is. It's so dominant, many of you know it all, but you'll actually see it play here. So we're going to start off with a video. And this is from Mike Boucher, has a quite good show on Sunday mornings that's seen in most of the state, and it's called Up Front. And this is actually recent. This is just from this past weekend. And you're going to hear two legislators, one Democrat, one Republican, talk about the civil service, as I like to call it, repeal bill. It's not a reform bill, it's a repeal bill. And I'll stop occasionally to comment, point out some things that are of note, in case you don't have an opportunity to catch it. We'll just do a little point by point there. So I will mute my audio. So you'll get
The committee will hold a hearing on the bill Tuesday, and we're looking at civil service changes today with the bill's assembly sponsor, Majority Leader Jim Steineke of Kaukauna, and a Democratic opponent, Representative Diane Hesselbein of Middleton. Thanks to both of you for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Representative Steineke, let me begin with you. Why is this needed?
Well, currently, as we talked to agencies over the last few months, it became more and more clear to us that changes were needed. One of the reasons is currently under the way things are structured, it can take anywhere from 5 to 8 months to hire a single individual. That's a serious problem, especially when you look 5 years out from today. 23% of the state's workforce is going to be eligible for retirement. In 10 years, that balloons to 40%. So we need to streamline the system to be able to get employees in the door faster, also make sure that we're hiring the best and the brightest to serve the state.
Representative
feedback. So I just wanted to stop there and quickly point out a couple of key points. One of them is he started with this idea that they've talked to all the agency heads, and this is something they want. So they're creating a sense that This is actually something that's wanted, desired by the agency heads themselves. And then he goes on to talk about streamlining government. We've all heard this kind of talk before. And what it comes down to is this idea that it is the private sector which is the most efficient model of, for example, employee management, something like that. So that's really an important point because he's making the connection between the private sector as being the model that we need to choose.
Esselbein, why no changes? Why do you think this is not a good idea?
Well, the civil service started in 1905, and the theory was the best shall serve the state. And it was signed into law by former governor, Republican, Bob LaFollette, who's been a hero of mine for years, possibly yours too. And it really allowed anybody, no matter what their background, their education, to rise to that level, to take a test and to say whether they were a short order cook or they had their PhD, take a test that you don't know who's taking it, and at the end of the day, who scores the highest will get the job. And that's what Bob LaFollette worked against his entire life, is cronyism and trying to make it simple in the state of Wisconsin, and it's working.
And that's your concern that there will be cronyism, that somehow this will open the door for friends of friends to be appointed to jobs within state government?
Absolutely. I think we've seen that in WEDC. It just became a slush fund for the governor for his campaign contributors. I worry that what they're going to be applying for those jobs using resume based by the Department of Administration. What is the first thing they're going to check? Whether they sign the recall. That's currently how people are chosen at the Board of Regents right now, especially if you're a student trying to get that position. Is that what they're going to check? Did you sign the recall? Have you been a campaign contributor? And what your affiliation is.
Okay, so you get the idea. The Democratic response to the civil service appeal is the idea that it's going to allow for cronyism and patronage to come back into the system. So that's kind of how the two sides are positioning themselves. And I want to open the first poll right away because I want to get your kind of just gut feeling on this. So I'm going to open the first poll. Should be, there we go. So this is an open question. So you just heard from the two sides, and I just wanted to get your gut reaction briefly. And this is an open question. You can just type in a response there. Is that what point caught your attention the most? There were several things brought up there. So just take a couple minutes and think about what grabbed your attention. In some responses. So I'll just and Anne's got hers in the chat box there, that the anonymity through which people would be judged by the exam resulting in fairness. So she's thinking in terms of fairness. I think we've got a majority of people have responded here. So let's see. Interesting. So we have kind of some split decisions here. So we have, this is interesting. So one person thought that the idea that the system is inefficient stood out. Of course, Anne talked about the fairness aspect of it. We have actually a couple responses, a few actually, that talk about how long the system's been working. That It's back in the early 1900s with fighting Bob La Follette, and it's been working well since then. So the kind of tradition of open government being very strong, and then something about the agency in the chat box down there. Maybe Phil can fix that chat box. So it's interesting that out of what was said, that the consensus was kind of around the tradition, the idea of fairness on the side, and then on the conservative side, clearly the idea that it's inefficient, it's broken, resonates. That's a good, Philip makes a great point that the agency heads are appointed by the governor. Yes, that's correct. Yes. So the agency head would be appointed by the governor, and just hold that thought, because that brings up a point that's coming up related to this slide here. So if you look at the authoritarian conservative frame of the civil service system, there's a few key points that need to be made and underscored in the frame that we need to be aware of. But the first one, as you all probably will have guessed, is that the idea that the public is immoral. It takes away incentives for private success, which leads to this idea that the private sector model is the most efficient. Right? If you have an efficient system, then you are streamlined for success. And then you have this competition and reward system that's based on this formula of success comes from discipline, which is what makes you moral. Right? So you have the successful people who rise to the top are the ones who are the most disciplined. And of course, who is that defined by? The authoritarian figure, which, to Philip's point, is the agency heads appointed by the governor. So you're starting to set up this authoritarian system. And one of the things that's important about that is when they talk about doing evaluations, and this is a little bit of detail, but Professor Moynihan from College School has pointed this out, is that the evaluations performed by an agency head regarding an employee are only as good as the agency head. In other words, you have, good point, greater than 90% of private startups fail, yes. And of course, there's real reasons for that. But I digress. So there's this idea that there are all sorts of biases that people will bring into doing those evaluations. Right? If you are depending on a particular agency head who's appointed by a partisan political person, that person is bringing all sorts of personal, political, social biases with them, which will result in completely uneven and unfair evaluations. So those are important points that are very evident in the private sector. The final point I have on there I think is important, and it's this idea of salient exemplar. And throughout this process, when we were going through the whole Act 10 thing a few years ago, we heard all these examples of extreme behavior on the part of public employees. Right? In the press conference to introduce this bill, the authors talked about how there was one employee, public employee in some agency, who watched an average of 2.4 hours of pornography a day at his work computer. And basically, they make it sound like this happens all the time. We can't get rid of these people. It's contributing to the immorality of the public sector. So that's actually salient exemplar, which kind of this idea that the exception is the rule. And people really believe it. It's very powerful. And it works really well. Marketing agencies use it to sell products. Ronald Reagan used it with the whole welfare queen thing. That creating this kind of metaphorical image of some extreme behavior, generally negative, is the norm. And that's something we have to be aware of and counter. So I've got the next poll here, and I want to just revisit this this question in a slightly different way. So in terms of which conservative idea did you hear that stood out the most, I have multiple choices there based on what we just talked about. So vote at any time. So did the public government is immoral stand out, private sector the most efficient, ill votes are coming in fast and furious, competition and reward system, salient exemplar, wasn't really brought up in that interview, but we know it exists. So test your votes. Will I take a drink of water? And Ann thought competition and reward. So we'll add 1 to the competition and reward tally there. We're just about there. So if you have to vote, now's your chance. Here we go. So just, we have all of the above. We kind of have some split decisions here, again, which is good. There's no wrong answer. I'm just more curious as to which is resonating with people. All of the above is clearly resonating with people based on the poll here. So let's see. So yes, so all of the above, it's kind of a three-way tie here between the competition reward system is very powerful, and probably because you hear it all the time, not only in the political arena, but we also hear it all the time in marketing and commercials. And then all of the above also garnered a third. So we kind of had a third, a third, a third. We had a vote for private sector as most efficient, which really kind of dovetails into the whole public is immoral. And you should have seen a poll should have come up on your screen. So you might have a technical glitch there that we can touch base on later. So, so there's that poll. Okay, very interesting, and I hope informative. You may have to scroll down to see the other questions, Dan. Depending on how your screen works, you may need to just scroll down. So now that we've all been immersed in the conservative frame, we know where conservatives stand, we know values that they're evoking. What can we say about the progressive frame, and how do we counter this? Well, let's start with the kind of the 3 main points of the progressive frame of government. First, obviously, private depends on the public. Second, very important, the public government has a responsibility to protect and empower the people that they represent. And then the definition of democracy being this idea that caring citizens act together to provide resources for people to be free and pursue meaningful life. So these are kind of the 3-legged stool of the progressive frame and how it applies to government. And what's important about this is that, I'm just going to go back so you can absorb those a little bit longer. If you take those principles and you apply them to what Republicans are doing and what conservatives are doing, it provides us basically ammunition to undermine their frame, to undermine their message. And here are 3 examples of that. First of all, Republicans want to reward their friends while turning their backs on the people they are supposed to serve. Right, that gets to the favoritism, cronyism, but more importantly, scroll back here, this idea that the public has a responsibility to protect and empower the people because we depend on the public, right? That is a key undermining of what they're doing. Second, the Republicans are putting cronyism and patronage over the people. Again, going back this idea of responsibility and also what democracy and our government is supposed to do. It's supposed to provide resources for people to be free to pursue meaningful life, right? Not to reward your cronies. So important undermine. Finally, this idea that they're betraying the trust of the people by destroying what we've worked so hard to build together. That kind of underscores all those points. And why is this important? Because this resonates with people. We have some really strong evidence based on the Marquette Law poll that people get this, and this resonates with people. When you consider that over 60% of the people in the state don't think that Scott Walker cares for people like them, and that was the question. Does Scott Walker care about people like you? Over 60% of people strongly or largely disagreed with that statement. And one of the things that we need to say is that, look, the way we do things in Wisconsin, right, the way we are in Wisconsin is that our elected representatives care about us, not their big money political cronies. So very important messaging there. So now let's open up a poll to see what your perceptions are. And in some ways, you all are probably a little more learned than the average person, but in terms of framing. But which progressive ideas did you hear? We have the three: private depends on the public, public has a responsibility for protecting power, democracy is caring people providing freedom, all the above, none of the above. Which of those did you hear in what Representative Hesselbein said? Sorry, in that particular video clip, just in the video clip. I'm not talking about, just in general or what your feelings are, but in that specific video clip, which of those did you hear? Let's wait on a couple more votes here. Okay. Yeah, so Ann, we'll have to chat afterwards to see if you can just question, not the poll. Okay, so we'll end the voting, and we actually had, so we had kind of a split decision again. Specifically, a few people heard that the public has a responsibility to protect and empower all people, which I would agree, because of the whole, she talked about political cronyism and that kind of thing. All the above, a couple people, and actually the same, a few people also thought none of the above, right? So that's kind of a problem, right? Because my purpose for doing this was to kind of demonstrate that if you are all conscious of framing and are aware of what's going on politically, and you can't determine a strong message there from progressives to counter the very strong, let's just say the very strong message from conservatives, about how great the private sector is, how inefficient government is, how broken the system is, then we're in some serious trouble. So I just wanted to explore this whole idea of how we can effectively reframe this issue. And one of them goes all the way back to, it probably even predates Act 10. And one of the things that public sector unions didn't do a real good job of during the whole Act 10 struggle was to frame public servants in a way that people value. That the public sector, public workers, there's union members, the idea that they're lazy, undisciplined, that the union protects bad teachers, bad employees, that whole thing really resonated and it really stuck. And it's really sticking to this day. So one of the critical points that has to happen at a very fundamental long-term change perspective is that we have to reframe public servants. And we really need to have people understand how, again, our private life, prosperity, and enterprise depends on the public. And it's this idea that we're fortunate to have dedicated public servants working for us. I saw a recent press release from Senator Weinhaut that kind of said something very similar to that, about how we are fortunate to have this, wonderful system of public service where, people actually work for the people of Wisconsin, not political cronies. And we need to start giving specific examples of how public servants ensure that a high quality of life is possible. I mean, consider things like the court system, like our electoral system, like people that fix the roads, people that do things, in the public sector. This idea of public service for the public good. This is a really critical message, and it's a critical time to start doing that because all over now we're seeing examples of infrastructure deteriorating and things like that happening that will cause people to feel a joint impact. So very critical. And the point that I have there that's bold is also one that should be right up front now, is this idea that, why did we establish a civil service system? Why did we as a people decide to establish this system? We did it to protect the people who protect us from greed and corruption. Because again, they work for us to make our lives in our state better, not for some political cronies. So that's a really important message. And then of course, this underlying public servants for the public good. And the irony of all this is that during the hearing on this bill, Representative Roth, who's one of the sponsors, you heard him in the video earlier, he actually engaged in negation during the hearing. Now, I'm not sure whether he's new, he's relatively new to the assembly. This might have just been him kind of getting off talking points and just responding to what he was hearing and responding to what he was being asked in the hearing. But here's what he said. Nothing in this bill will make it easier to revert back to the days before 1905 when we had cronyism and political patronage. Nothing in this bill takes away from the core concept of what the civil service system is. Now, isn't that interesting? You should all be thinking, don't think of an elephant right now, because this is what he's doing. So he's evoking the ideas that I have in red there, right? Roth is evoking the idea that this bill will make it easier to revert back to cronyism and patronage. Right? Even though he negates it, this is the idea that he's evoking in people's minds. Right? And that the bill takes away from the core concept of what the civil service system is. So this example of negation reinforces what we want people to think and understand about the civil service process, right? So now is the time for us to start saying it, to harp on the idea of cronyism and patronage, and that will be the result of this bill. And talk about the core concept of what the system is. And I will back up, right? The system protects the people, us, protects the people, protects the public servants, right, who protect us from political greed and corruption, because they work for us to make our lives in the state better. And then, of course, examples of that would be fantastic, right? Protecting nature, protecting our wonderful land, our water, our beautiful state, keeping it clean, keeping the court system working for everyone. All of those things we should be talking about. Oh, Don says, is public servant for our, is public servant for public good circular? It should be for our good. So public servant for our good. Well, technically, linguistically, yes, you're right. It is circular. In this case, linguistically, we're trying to get people to understand that public is us. So a modification that would be good would be public servants for our public good, something like that. I hope that answers your question, Don. It looks like you're typing. Okay, yeah. So public servants for our public good would also be, because we want people to start equating this idea that we are government. And therefore, that's what government should be. Good question. So there's our opportunity. So there's the civil service repeal, right? Now we also are dealing with this terrible idea of destroying the GAB, and the Republicans call it reform. So, the biggest, issue with framing that we need to start doing is connecting other issues through framing. Because if you go on the Wheeler Report from over the last couple days, the Wheeler Report collects press releases from all the legislators, issue groups, advocacy organizations, political parties, things like that. And it's all displayed on one website. And it's they're time-stamped, they're sorted by day. But if you go and look at the press releases on both of these issues, you'll see that they kind of tend to be all over the board. They get really caught up in the details of what these specific agencies do. So here's the press release from the Wheeler Report, and the link is there. It'll be up on the web tomorrow along with the archive. And note the highlighted in red phrases there. So this is Robin Vos, obviously the speaker, and Dean Knudsen, who was one of the authors of the bill, along with Senator Leah Buchner. This is from last week. So notice the title, GAB Reform Legislation Unveiled. It's the idea of reform, right? So they're saying that the bipartisan commissions that they're going to create will promote accountability and transparency. So there is a clear case of using conservative language and conservative ideas. So anytime you are tempted to use the words accountability and transparency, be very, very careful of the context. And then this idea that the bill will overhaul the GAB. Strong metaphor there, right? Because if something needs overhauling, it's got to be what? Just terribly broken. And then this idea from the quote here that we're putting accountability back into the administration of elections, adding a new level of transparency to restore lost confidence in an agency that has failed to follow the letter of the law. That's really strong conservative stuff there. So I will open the poll, and as I open the poll, I'm also going to go back to the screen here. This is a multiple choice. There's the PowerPoint. And the poll, should I get the right one here? Oops, that's the wrong one. Hold on a second. We want this one. Okay. So, multiple choice. From that press release, which conservative ideas did you hear evoked there? And there's definitely one stands out. And congratulations, because actually most of you are getting it right. Public is immoral, private sector most efficient, discipline leads to success, therefore morality, all of the above, none of the above. And yes, the voting is done already. That was, yeah. And the whole idea of the public being immoral was very strong in there. I'm going to actually back up. There it is. Okay. So, yes, public is immoral. How does that? Because accountability, transparency, failing to follow the letter of the law, lost confidence, it needs overhaul, right? All these things point to the idea that the public is immoral, that the public isn't working, that it's, again, broken. And another response there was the idea of discipline, right? Yes, they need discipline. Accountability and transparency are there to provide discipline, right? Because if somebody's not accountable, then they need discipline. So well done. Everybody caught that really well. So here's an example of what progressive issue groups are saying just in response. This one came, this is from the same day as the conservative. This is from Wisconsin Voices. They have a coalition of kind of voting rights advocacy groups that are, it's called Our Democracy 2020. Here's what they said. This bill would destroy our nonpartisan, independent GAB. And then we believe in holding the legislature and the government more accountable, not less. It's clear Speaker Boss, Majority Leader Fitzgerald want to consolidate their power at our expense. So we're going to have a poll coming up here on what, but I just want to point out a couple things. So destroying nonpartisan independent GAB, that's kind of okay, but the point is that conservatives do want to destroy government, right? That's what they want. So I don't know that that's going to really influence any bad conceptions. But then the idea of being evoked about holding the legislature and the government more accountable, that's conservative language. And when you think about what the Republicans are trying to do, is they're trying to hold the government more accountable in their moral frame, in what they consider to be moral, not progressives, conservatives. So talking about holding them accountable does not mean in terms of progressive morality, the progressive worldview. And then consolidating power, well, power comes from the authority figure. That's when you talk about consolidating power, it talks about consolidating power, which comes from the authority figure. That's how it's supposed to work. So really, this statement really evokes conservative language. And So this is from legislative leadership on the same day. And there's a point that I want to make here, and I think it's important here. So Representative Barca, who's the, if you don't know, is the minority leader in the Assembly, they talk about turning our respected system of nonpartisan watchdogs into partisan lapdogs. Okay, kind of an interesting metaphor. You get the idea that a watchdog is it's tough. It's gonna keep an eye out. It's gonna attack when it's threatened. Into a lapdog, it just kind of sits there. Again, people get the metaphor, but I'm not sure how effective that is if the whole idea that conservatives have is to actually do that to government, because government's not capable of being a watchdog. So then he talks about not replacing the current GAB with partisan advocates focused on partisan gain rather than faithfully enforcing state law. And that the proposal consolidates power, opens the door for corruption and cronyism, and it flies in the face of issues that people care about. Okay, so let's do kind of a plus and minus there. What's good about that statement? Well, what's good is he starts getting into the idea of corruption and cronyism in state government, and the idea of partisan gain rather than faithfully enforcing state law. That's starting to scratch the surface of the responsibility that the public has to protect people, right? And the idea that private depends on the public. So it's starting to get at that. But then on the minus side, it is this, again, consolidating power, but also the last statement really kind of bugs me, because it's kind of saying that people don't care about this, right? They want to, he says that it flies in the face of the issues that the people of Wisconsin really care about. So in essence, several legislators and groups have said this, and what's kind of concerning about it is that they're implying that it's a small deal, when this is the essence of open government. This is the essence of democracy. And by saying that, they're kind of writing off the people of Wisconsin that they don't worry about it. It's, it's not a big deal. This is a big deal. And they should be saying it's a big deal. And then it's something that people deeply care about. Because when they say that, people are more likely to pay attention. It's kind of the bully pulpit thing. So I'm curious to see, kind of done a little review here. So I'd like to get your impression. Do those two statements evoke any of these progressive ideas for any of you? They're the same progressive ideas: private depends on the public responsibility to protect and empower, democracy is caring people, providing freedom, all the above or none of the above. And a lot of people are saying protect and empower. Some are saying all the above. But lots saying, the majority are saying public has a responsibility to protect them. And again, there's no wrong answer here. This is all what your perceptions are in terms of framing. So there's no wrong answer here. And while people are voting, Philip, you didn't finish your thought in the chat box there that it seems this GAB quote unquote reform shows how much they, it looked like you started typing they want to do something. Or all right, so votes are in. And yes, the vast majority of people think that the idea evoked is responsibility, protect, and empower. And that's very important that you heard that, because that also means that we have an opportunity for that to resonate with people. So when we look at, I got ahead of myself, there we go. When we look at effective messages that connect through values, and so we've seen the kind of the three-legged stool, as I like to call it, of democracy in the progressive frame. And then what I want to point out is these are kind of core messages for our civil service system, right? For protecting the people who protect us. Well, guess what? Do you see how these messages will work with the GAB issue? With maybe a little bit of tweaking going on? That they want to reward their friends while they turn their backs on the people they're supposed to serve, right? Because if they're going to make it easier for people to just spend unlimited amounts of money in influence elections, what does that do, right? Political cronyism and patronage over the people. They're betraying the trust by destroying everything we've worked so hard to build together, such as the GAB, which, look, we all decided to form the GAB after the caucus scandal because we never wanted that to happen again. This can help remind people of that. So, again, those effective messages, again, these work for the GAB, and they will work for the John Doe issue as well. So here's how we can provide some specifics about the GAB, about John Doe procedures, about civil servants and public servants. But as George Lakoff likes to say, and yes, Philip, they're friends of the 1%. And right, people are starting to get that. Right, Bernie Sanders' populist statements, his populism is starting to get people to understand that. Right, so we talk about them, go back one slide here, turning their backs on people to reward their friends in the 1%. People understand that we're using the term friends sarcastically. So, just like Bernie Sanders does when he talks about his friends on the other side of the aisle. So I hope this resonates with people. And I do want to show you that Representative Barca and some others, their message is starting to evolve a little bit. Okay, just kind of look at what he's saying here. He's close, but as I say, no cigar. Right? Working to improve security for hardworking people. Right? Instead of doing that, they're dead set on making it easier for corruption and cronyism to go undetected. So corporate special interests have more influence in government. Hardworking taxpayers want us to address, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need less government oversight, more corporate influence, and then the whole watchdogs and lapdogs. So take a minute, a few seconds there actually, and just absorb that statement, because there's something missing there. Okay, I'm going to go back to, so here's our, so look at the three-legged stool. Private depends on the public responsibility to protect and empower, democracy, caring citizens acting together for people. There's something missing in this statement. And unlike the other polls, I did have a correct answer in mind when I designed this poll. So let's see. Here we go. Open poll. There we go. Oops, hold on a second. Sorry, wrong one. Poll number 6. Here it is. Okay, so which of those progressive ideas is missing from Peter Barca's statement? And actually, I will say there are actually technically two responses because one comes directly out of the other. So most people have chosen private depends on the public. All of the above. Yeah, it's not real clear. It's true. You definitely have to go fishing for it. Okay, looks like pretty much all the votes are in. So private depends on the public, and public has responsibility to protect and empower all people. Pretty much ruled the day there. So in getting back to the idea that, yes, those two things were missing. And what's really important about that is that how we frame the public is critical, right? Because people have a basic distrust of government, right? So the statement that Representative Barca put out, much like every other statement from most Democrats, doesn't talk about the public in the progressive frame. And people have a basic distrust of government. And why is that? It's based on the current common sense, which is conservative. It provides a cognitive acceptance of extreme measures, right? People don't get upset over these things because they don't just distrust government, or they don't trust government. So it's acceptable for them. It provides this kind of acceptance of the salient exemplar examples. And it makes these issues both moral and political at the same time. Because if people don't trust government, right, then they're not going to care so much if it's destroyed. So it really makes framing an absolute necessity. So what can we do? Well, if you leave with knowing just this one thing, know that reframing this will give people something to be outraged about, right? So if all of these things that I have listed here are true, that public servants and services make a high quality life possible for all people in Wisconsin, you know, and not just, yes, that's a good point. Philip, absolutely, yes, absolutely. Orwellian is correct. And linguistically, the conservatives use Orwellian language where they are the weakest because they have to. And framing gives us a way to expose the truth without using their language. And as I say here, framing will give some people something to be really upset about and act on. You know, it's a little disheartening to hear Democrats and progressives all the time talking only about the middle class and hardworking taxpayers, because they represent everyone, right? There are a lot of people who don't pay taxes because they don't make enough money, and they still work hard every day to survive, and they're not in the middle class. You know, we can't leave people behind and segment people in that way. We actually, the next section of the presentation coming up here at the end gets to that. You know, that our elected officials have a moral responsibility to protect and empower all people, especially the people who serve us, and that what they're doing is betraying our trust and shirking their responsibilities to us, and that threatens to take us back to the days of cronyism and patronage. Right? And now, do you care about this? You see, this gets people at a more core level. So we're running just a bit behind. So you can think of this in terms of when you write your letters to the editor, when you talk to people in the community, when you're doing doors. You know, think about what you would say to really get at people about this. You know, what frame, you know, what message here is going to be the most critical in your community, in your neighborhood, and with your friends and family, and how do you present it to them in a way that they will care about? So I want to finish tonight, and feel free to type questions in there or ask questions, because as I said, we're just a little behind, but this is, we're going to have a really interesting little insight here on our framing. And as I've said before, as you heard George Lakoff and others talk about, the conservative frame is based on this hierarchy, right? It puts God over man, man over nature, men over women, the United States over other nations, Christians over non-Christians, whites over non-whites, et cetera, et cetera. It's part of their structure of the frame. So I want to talk about it in terms of something that is really, really happening a lot, is this idea of the men over women frame. And it has really destructive consequences. Like this happens with gender and race, nationality, religion, and it provides a lot of these unconscious biases that I referenced before, but it affects us physically and mentally in ways that we're not even aware of. And a really good illustration of that is happening right now in the medical field. Because the National Institutes of Health just came out with a policy that if you're going to do research, and you're going to get public money to do research on some medical specific issue or something like, or medical condition or disease or whatever it is, you have to examine the sex differences in whatever it is you're studying. Right? That women and men don't respond medically the same way, and they require vastly different treatments and things like that. This is a brilliant TED Talk. It's I've got just a few minutes here that just sit back, absorb it. We'll come back and just do a quick little recap on it from a framing perspective. But I think you will all find this fascinating, and I encourage you when it's up on the web to share it with people because it's critically important. So this is Dr. Alison McGregor. She is an emergency physician. She's the head of actually an institute at Brown University that studies the difference between men and women in treatment in emergency rooms. So very interesting stuff. So here we go. Oh, I should mute my microphone.
World War II changed a lot of things. And one of them was this need to protect people from becoming victims of medical research without informed consent. So some much-needed guidelines or rules were set into place. And part of that was this desire to protect women of childbearing age from entering into any medical research studies. There was fear. What if something happened to the fetus during the study? Who would be responsible? And so the scientists at this time actually thought this was a blessing in disguise. Because, let's face it, men's bodies are pretty homogeneous. They don't have the constantly fluctuating levels of hormones that could disrupt clean data they could get if they had only men. It was easier, it was cheaper. Not to mention at this time there was a general assumption that men and women were alike in every way, apart from their reproductive organs and sex hormones. So it was decided. Medical research was performed on men, and the results were later applied to women. What did this do to the notion of women's health? Women's health became synonymous with reproduction, breasts, ovaries, uterus, pregnancy. It's this term we now refer to as bikini medicine. And this stayed this way until about the 1980s, when this concept was challenged by the medical community and by the public health policymakers, when they realized that by excluding women from all medical research studies, we actually did them a disservice. And that apart from reproductive issues, virtually nothing was known about the unique needs of the female patient. Since that time, an overwhelming amount of evidence has come to light that shows us just how different men and women are in every way. You know, we have this saying in medicine, children are not just little adults. And we say that to remind ourselves that children actually have a different physiology than normal adults. And it's because of this that the medical specialty of pediatrics came to light. And we now conduct research on children in order to improve their lives. And I know the same thing can be said about women. Women are not just men with boobs and tubes.
I hope you all appreciated that line. That is a great line. So I'm just going to skip that because her conclusion says something that is really important to us in terms of framing. And then we'll just come back and do a quick recap from a framing perspective.
But I must warn you, this is not easy. In fact, it's hard. It's essentially changing the way we think about medicine and health and research. It's changing our relationship to the healthcare system. But there's no going back. We now know just enough to know that we weren't doing it right. Martin Luther King Jr. has said, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And the first step towards change is awareness. This is not just about improving medical care for women. This is about personalized, individualized health care for everyone. This awareness has the power to transform medical care for men and women. And from now on, I want you to ask your doctors whether the treatments you're receiving are specific to your sex and gender. They may not know the answer yet, but the conversation has begun, and together we can all learn. Remember, for me and my colleagues in this field, your sex and gender matter. Thank you.
So, interesting. And I hope you all take the opportunity to watch the full TED Talk. It's very well done. And her final message there is very important in terms of framing, and specifically this whole idea that we need to change common sense about a lot of things, particularly about women, because this is common sense about women even today in 2015, right? That women are reproductive vessels for men, right? She had that line, women are just men with boobs and tubes. She talks earlier in the lecture about how, you know, for many people, women are considered homogenous just as men are. And then we have this idea that women are emotional. I mean, we've talked about how important emotions are to thinking and how much they are important to your decision-making and unconscious process. So she talks about this idea of taking responsibility, and I would argue that this has to do with changing the frame. The idea that we have a responsibility to all people, right? It's not just that Black lives matter, but it's that sex and gender matter, that everyone matters. You know, we all matter. And if we take responsibility for all people as we do for ourselves, that is a very different worldview than what's currently happening in this hierarchical structure. She talked about personal specific health care, that it's necessary to be free and prosper, and also it's necessary for healthy communities, just like public education, just like a great civil service system, just like the Government Accountability Board. You get the idea. I want to leave you with this question. So you have two questions to consider tonight and act on. First of all, what can you do and say to help break down the destructive hierarchies that are around us? And then the first question is public in your community. So that is it for this presentation. You can ask questions. The archive will be up probably by about noon tomorrow, and I'll send an email to that effect. So if you have a question, click the Ask a Question button or start typing. Collaboration. Yes, absolutely. Promote collaboration, cooperation over competition. Right. Competition, people will do anything to get ahead. It leads to greed. Right? Excellent point. So thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording. We're going to end the session, and I hope to see you all very soon.